A Justice Department release just did something almost impossible in American politics. It put Donald Trump's name back into the Epstein story while also giving his defenders a ready-made argument to dismiss it. Because what was released was not a criminal charge, not a court finding, not a proven case, not a smoking gun. It was a set of previously withheld FBI interview summaries containing deeply serious allegations that were never verified, never charged, and are now exploding into public view at the exact moment the Justice Department itself is under pressure over what it released, what it held back, and why. And that is why this story is much bigger than one headline. Because if you stay with me, you're going to understand three things that most coverage is either blurring together or deliberately avoiding. First, what these newly released Epstein-related documents actually are and what they are not. Second, why Pam Bondi's looming subpoena matters more politically than the documents themselves. And third, the key insight that explains the whole thing, why in modern American politics the fight over information can become more important than the information itself. That last part is the real story. And by the end of this, that will make perfect sense. Because right now, this is not just about Jeffrey Epstein, it is not just about Donald Trump, and it is not just about one woman's allegations. This is about whether the American public still believes institutions tell the truth when the truth is politically dangerous. That is the battlefield now. And once you see it clearly, a lot of what has happened over the last few weeks stops looking random and starts looking like a power struggle over narrative control. Here's why that matters. The Department of Justice has already been under intense scrutiny over how it handled the release of millions of Epstein-related records under mounting public and congressional pressure. Then came another release. Additional files that officials said had been withheld after being mistakenly categorized as duplicates or protected materials. Among them were FBI interview memos describing uncorroborated allegations involving Trump. Meanwhile, bipartisan frustration over the DOJ's handling of the files escalated into a congressional subpoena for Attorney General Pam Bondi, with a House deposition scheduled for April 14. That sequence matters. Because if you're just casually scrolling headlines, the story looks simple. New Epstein files mention Trump. But if you slow down and actually examine what happened, you realize there are really two stories happening at once. Story number one is the allegation story. Story number two is the release story. And in politics, story number two often decides how story number one lands. So let's start where all serious analysis should start. What exactly happened? The DOJ released additional Epstein-related records after outside reporting and political pressure raised questions about whether all relevant materials had actually been made public. According to reporting on the release, these additional documents included FBI 302 interview summaries from 2019 describing a woman's allegations that she had been abused as a minor and that Trump was also involved. The allegations are extraordinarily serious. They are also unproven, uncorroborated, and were never the basis of charges against Trump. The White House forcefully denied them, calling them baseless and unsupported by credible evidence. That distinction is not a technicality. It is the entire foundation of responsible reporting. Because too much of the internet now operates on a toxic shortcut. If a claim appears in an FBI memo, people instantly treat it like proof. It is not proof. An FBI interview summary means investigators documented what a person said. That is all it means by itself. It tells you an allegation existed. It does not tell you the allegation was confirmed. And that is where a lot of political commentary instantly goes off the rails. One side wants to pretend the existence of the memo means Trump has been conclusively exposed. The other side wants to pretend the lack of charges means the memo is meaningless. Both are intellectually lazy. The real answer is harder and more uncomfortable. The existence of these records matters. The seriousness of the allegation matters. The fact that it was not proven also matters. And the fact that it was not included in earlier releases matters too. You need all four pieces at the same time if you actually care about truth instead of team sports. Because the first big question here is not just, What does the document say? The first big question is, why did the public get it now? That is where this becomes politically explosive. The Justice Department's explanation, according to multiple reports, is that some documents were incorrectly coded as duplicates, and others were initially treated as privileged or protected before being later released. In plain English, the government is saying these materials were not deliberately hidden for political reasons, but mishandled in the sorting and review process. Now, could that be true? Yes. If you are dealing with millions of pages, badly organized archives, overlapping agencies, privacy concerns, redaction standards, and old investigative files, bureaucratic mistakes are not just possible. They are common. But here's the problem: once trust collapses, even ordinary incompetence looks like conspiracy. And that is exactly where we are now, because this is not happening in a vacuum. This is happening in a country where half the public assumes powerful institutions are hiding something all the time, and the other half assumes political actors are manufacturing scandal all the time. So when the DOJ says, "These were withheld by mistake," millions of Americans do not hear a procedural explanation. They hear one of two things: either they got caught, or this is a planted political hit. That is how broken trust distorts everything. And it gets worse when the release itself appears messy. Some critics have accused the DOJ of mishandling redactions and transparency in ways that exposed victims while still shielding powerful names, fueling bipartisan anger over both privacy failures and selective disclosure. Those criticisms have not been limited to one ideological camp. Lawmakers, journalists, and advocates have all raised concerns that the process has looked chaotic, inconsistent, and politically combustible. That is a disaster politically. Because if your stated mission is transparency and your actual rollout creates fresh suspicion, then your release stops functioning like transparency and starts functioning like accelerant. And that is exactly what happened here. The public did not receive a clean, orderly, confidence-building disclosure. The public received another episode in a long-running institutional mess. And once that happens, the actual content of the files gets absorbed into something larger. A fight over legitimacy. Now let's be precise about the Trump angle, because this is where responsible commentary matters most. Donald Trump has long faced scrutiny over his social proximity to Jeffrey Epstein, just as many other wealthy and powerful people have. There are photographs, there are past public comments, there is a documented social overlap in elite circles from decades ago. That alone is not proof of criminal conduct. But it does mean any newly released allegation involving Trump is politically explosive even before it is legally meaningful. And that's the trap. People hear Trump and Epstein in the same sentence and immediately jump to a final conclusion they already wanted to reach. But politics is not a courtroom, and the internet is not evidence. You can absolutely say this is serious. You can absolutely say it deserves scrutiny. You can absolutely say the release raises legitimate questions. What you cannot honestly say, based on what has been publicly described so far, is that this release alone proves criminal guilt. That is not caution, that is discipline. And if you lose that discipline, you stop doing analysis and start doing propaganda. Now here is where the story takes its first major turn. Because the biggest immediate political danger to the administration may not actually be the allegation itself. It may be the appearance that the DOJ cannot convincingly explain its own process. That is where Pam Bondi enters the picture. Attorney General Pam Bondi has now been subpoenaed by the House Oversight Committee as lawmakers intensify scrutiny over the Justice Department's compliance with Epstein-related disclosure requirements and its handling of the broader file release. Reporting indicates that the subpoena followed bipartisan frustration, including support from some Republicans, and compels Bondi to answer questions in a deposition scheduled for April 14. DOJ officials have publicly argued the subpoena is unnecessary and said lawmakers have already been offered access and briefings. That is not a small development, because once you subpoena the Attorney General, the story evolves from "what's in the files" to "what is the government doing with the files?" And that second question is much more dangerous institutionally. Why? Because allegations can often be dismissed by political tribes. But process failures are harder to contain. If Bondi gets questioned under oath or in a formal congressional setting about why documents were withheld, how materials were coded, what redaction standards were used, who made those calls, and whether politically sensitive material was treated differently, then the story stops being just about Trump and starts becoming a competence and credibility crisis for the Justice Department itself. That matters because in Washington, cover-up optics often do more damage than underlying facts. Even when there is no formal cover-up, even when the explanation is mostly bureaucratic, even when nobody can prove intent. If it looks like information moved in a politically convenient pattern, the damage is already done. And that is where this entire situation becomes strategically important for both parties. Because Democrats and anti-Trump media figures see an obvious opening here. Their argument is straightforward: if these records existed and were not initially released, why not? And if the DOJ claimed transparency while sensitive material involving Trump was absent, why should the public trust the process? That is a politically powerful argument because it does not require proving the allegation. It only requires proving the release was incomplete, selective, or badly handled. And that is a much easier case to make in public than proving underlying criminal conduct. But Republicans and Trump allies also have a powerful counterargument. Their argument is this: if the allegation had real evidentiary strength, why was there never a charge? Why did previous investigators not act on it? And why is this surfacing publicly in this way now? That is also a politically powerful argument because it taps directly into a broader conservative belief that institutions selectively surface damaging narratives against Trump while failing to meet the standard of proof that would normally justify public certainty. And if you're being honest, you can see why both arguments resonate. That is why this story is so potent, because each side has just enough material to reinforce what it already believes, which means the public does not get clarity. The public gets confirmation bias, and that is how trust dies. But here's the part almost nobody is talking about. The most important political actor in this story may not be Trump, and it may not even be Bondi. It may be the ordinary voter who is not obsessed with every document but is watching the pattern. That voter may not know what an FBI 302 is. That voter may never read a single page. That voter may not care about legal nuance. But that voter absolutely understands one thing: when government agencies keep saying everything is out, and then more things keep coming out later, something feels off. That feeling matters. Because politics at scale is often less about what people can prove than what they conclude from repeated behavior. And repeated behavior is what builds narrative reality. If the public sees first release, then criticism, then missing materials, then more disclosures, then congressional subpoenas, then official defensiveness, the public starts constructing a story whether officials like it or not. That story becomes, they are not telling us everything. Now, is that always fair? No, but it is politically real, and if you ignore that, you will miss what this does to the 2026 and 2028 information environment. Because this is not just about whether Trump takes damage. This is about whether every future government disclosure is now automatically treated as partial, manipulated, or politically filtered. That is a major problem for a democracy. And yes, I know some people will say, well, that distrust already existed. True, but events like this harden it, they institutionalize it, they turn general cynicism into learned expectation. And once citizens start assuming every sensitive release is curated for political effect, official transparency stops restoring confidence and starts deepening suspicion. That is the paradox. The more government tries to manage trust through controlled disclosure, the more it can accidentally destroy trust when the control becomes visible. That is the first real lesson of this story. Now let's go deeper into the substance, because this is where the public conversation gets dangerously sloppy. There is a difference between three things: an allegation, an investigated allegation, and a proven allegation. Those are not the same category, they never were, and collapsing them together is how public discourse becomes useless. An allegation means someone said something happened. An investigated allegation means authorities took some steps to assess it. A proven allegation means evidence met a standard strong enough for charges, findings, or legal conclusions. Those are radically different levels of certainty. And if you erase those distinctions, you can smear anyone or excuse anyone depending on your political preference. That is why disciplined language matters so much in a case like this. Because if you overstate what is known, you hand Trump's defenders an easy escape hatch. And if you understate what was released, you help institutions bury serious questions inside procedural jargon. The correct approach is neither hysterical nor dismissive. It is this: the documents are real, the allegations are serious, they are not proven, the delayed release is politically significant. And the DOJ now has a burden to explain itself clearly and credibly. That is the honest frame. And it is also the strongest frame because it cannot be easily knocked down by either side. Now let's talk about why this lands so hard specifically in relation to Trump. Because Trump is not a normal political figure in the American system. For his supporters, every new allegation often gets filtered through a pre-existing belief that the system has tried for years to take him down through leaks, investigations, selective outrage, and institutional warfare. For his critics, every new revelation often gets filtered through a pre-existing belief that he has repeatedly escaped accountability because power, celebrity, and political loyalty shield him from consequences. Both camps have memory. Both camps have grievance. Both camps have receipts they believe validate their worldview. So when a story like this drops, nobody is processing it fresh. They are slotting it into a long-running emotional and political storyline that already exists in their head. That means this is not just a document release, it is an activation event. It activates every previous argument about elite protection, about selective prosecution, about media framing, about institutional bias, about truth versus power, and that is why the reaction is so intense, because the documents are not entering a neutral environment. They are entering a battlefield already on fire. Now this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The more politically charged the allegation becomes, the more important the process becomes. That sounds backward, but it is actually how Washington works. If a politically explosive allegation appears in a messy, inconsistent, or suspicious release process, the process can end up dominating the public understanding of the allegation itself. That is exactly what is happening now. Instead of the country focusing only on what is true, the country is also focusing on who decided what we got to see and when. And once that question takes over, you are in institutional crisis territory. Because the DOJ is supposed to be one of the few places where process still matters. Not vibes, not tribal loyalty, not online spin, process. If even the appearance of process integrity collapses there, the downstream damage spreads everywhere. Into congressional oversight, into public trust, into media legitimacy, into future criminal investigations, into election narratives, and yes, into financial and geopolitical stability too. Because global investors, foreign governments, and domestic power centers all watch the same thing. Can the American system still manage politically dangerous information without looking unstable? That question is bigger than this case. It goes to the heart of whether the US still projects institutional seriousness. And when the answer starts looking shaky, the consequences do not stay inside Washington. They bleed outward. Let's talk about the strategic political impact. For Trump personally, this story is dangerous in a very specific way, not because it automatically creates legal peril tomorrow, not because it instantly changes his core base, and not because one document release by itself rewrites the political map. It is dangerous because it reinforces the single most toxic image problem Trump has with persuadable voters. Chaos and moral contamination around the people and environments orbiting him. That matters. Swing voters do not always follow details, but they do absorb atmospherics. And atmospherically, anything that puts Trump back into the same headline universe as Epstein is bad political weather, even if his supporters reject it, even if the allegation is unproven, even if no legal action follows. Politics is not just about legal exposure, it is about narrative residue, and narrative residue lingers. Now, does that mean this is automatically devastating for him? No. Because Trump has survived repeated storms by doing something many traditional politicians cannot do, he turns accusations into proof of persecution for his base. That is a real political skill, whether people like it or not. And if the administration or the DOJ looks sloppy, selective, or manipulative in how this material emerged, Trump world will use that not merely as a defense but as a counterattack. They will say, see, they had years. They had every reason, they still have no case. And now they're leaking garbage through bureaucratic theater. That message will work on a lot of people, especially if Bondi's testimony or DOJ explanations look evasive rather than clean. So politically, the administration faces a narrow and difficult challenge. If it appears too defensive, it looks guilty. If it appears too aggressive, it looks weaponized. If it appears too sloppy, it looks incompetent. That is a terrible triangle to operate inside. And this is why Bondi's upcoming confrontation with Congress matters so much. Because in moments like this, credibility is not won by press releases. It is won by whether officials can answer simple questions in a way that ordinary people find believable. Questions like, who decided these files were duplicates? When was that decision made? Who reviewed the redactions? Were politically sensitive materials handled differently? How many other documents were withheld and later restored? Were members of Congress or outside investigators given complete access before the public was? Was the release process designed for truth or for damage control? Those are not fringe questions, those are central questions. And if the answers sound lawyered, fragmented, or incomplete, the suspicion deepens. That is how institutions lose the room. And once they lose the room, even accurate explanations stop landing. Now let's widen the lens, because this is not just a scandal story. It is a stress test of American political memory. What do I mean by that? I mean the public now carries a deep archive of unresolved elite stories. Epstein is one of them, not because every rumor is true, not because every name in the orbit is guilty, but because the public overwhelmingly believes the full truth about how power protected him was never fully delivered. That belief is central. And once a society starts believing there is a permanent protected zone around elites, every partial disclosure becomes proof of concealment. That is why Epstein remains uniquely combustible years after his death. People do not just see a criminal case. They see a symbol of a world where ordinary rules stop applying once money, access, celebrity, and influence get dense enough. And when that symbol intersects with a former president, a sitting political movement, and the Department of Justice, it becomes radioactive, because it touches every major fracture line in the country at once: power, sex, class, media. Institutions, truth, protection, accountability. That is not just a news cycle, that is a civic pressure point. And when those pressure points get hit, the reaction is never contained. That is why this story is not going away quickly, even if no dramatic legal development follows. Because the legal dimension is only one layer, the symbolic dimension is much larger. And symbolism drives politics more than most analysts want to admit. And what happened next changed the entire calculation. The story stopped being merely about what had been released and became about whether the release itself had exposed a deeper problem inside the DOJ's handling of the Epstein archive. That shift is crucial, because once Congress gets involved in that way, the issue becomes harder to dismiss as internet noise. A subpoena is not a meme. A deposition threat is not just social media chatter. Bipartisan frustration is not nothing. Again, that does not prove some grand plot, but it does tell you the institutional discomfort is real. And serious institutions do not like being dragged into public fights over whether they have withheld politically sensitive material. So now the question becomes, what happens next? There are basically four possible paths. Path 1. The DOJ gives a relatively coherent explanation, Bondi contains the damage, and the story gradually narrows back down to the fact that these were unproven allegations in old FBI summaries. If that happens, Trump likely takes some reputational splash damage, but the broader institutional crisis cools. Path 2. Bondi's answers raise more questions than they resolve. That would extend the life of the story and shift focus toward process irregularities, missing records, selective disclosure, and congressional confrontation. That is the most dangerous path for the DOJ. Path 3. Additional records emerge, whether through official release, leaks, litigation, or oversight review, and the public discovers the first missing documents fight was not the end of the story. That would be politically explosive even if the content were less dramatic than people imagine, because it would confirm the pattern of incomplete disclosure. Path 4. The story fragments into partisan information bubbles, with each side claiming total vindication and the broader public simply walking away more cynical than before. And honestly, that fourth path is probably the default in modern America. That is the sad part. Even major institutional failures no longer guarantee clarity, they often just produce exhaustion. And exhaustion is politically useful for people in power, because tired citizens are easier to manage than informed citizens. That is why staying precise matters so much. Now let's talk about the media. Because the media's performance in a story like this is incredibly important. There are two classic failure modes. Failure mode number 1, sensationalism. That is when outlets blur allegation into implication and implication into assumed guilt because they know outrage gets clicks. Failure mode number 2, overcorrection. That is when outlets become so afraid of being accused of sensationalism that they bury the significance of what was released under sterile legal caveats until the public stops paying attention. Both are bad, both mislead, and both deepen distrust. The responsible middle ground is harder, but it exists. It is entirely possible to say these newly released files are newsworthy, they contain serious allegations. Those allegations are not established facts. The delayed release raises legitimate institutional questions, and the public deserves straight answers without spin. That is not a partisan position. That is the minimum standard of honest civic reporting. And if major institutions cannot meet that standard, alternative ecosystems rush in to fill the vacuum. That is when conspiracy entrepreneurs make their money. That is when propaganda channels explode. That is when emotionally satisfying lies beat boring, incomplete truth, because nature hates a vacuum and politics hates one even more. So if official America cannot tell a coherent story, unofficial America will. And unofficial America is usually louder, faster, angrier, and less careful. That is exactly why stories like this become so unstable online. One half of the internet will insist the release proves a hidden monster has finally been exposed. The other half will insist the release proves the deep state is fabricating one last desperate smear. Both narratives will spread faster than the underlying documents. Both will outperform nuance. Both will reward emotional certainty, and both will leave millions of people less informed than they were before. That is not a side effect anymore. That is the system. Now let's bring this to the level of power. What does this mean strategically for Washington? First, it weakens institutional confidence at a moment when institutional confidence is already thin. Second, it creates a new line of attack against the DOJ and potentially against the administration's broader credibility. Third, it ensures that the Epstein issue remains politically alive not because of one revelation, but because the release process itself has become contested terrain. And fourth, it gives both parties material to weaponize. Democrats and anti-Trump voices can say, the files existed, they were not all released. Why? Republicans and pro-Trump voices can say, they still have no proven case, yet the allegation is being amplified anyway. Notice what happens there? Both sides can attack institutions while still advancing their own political goals. That is the really dangerous part. Because once everyone benefits from distrust, almost nobody has an incentive to repair trust. And that is where democracies start decaying in plain sight, not with one dramatic collapse, but with repeated episodes where truth becomes secondary to positioning. That is the larger warning embedded in this story. And it matters far beyond Washington. Because when the American public stops believing sensitive information can be released fairly, the effects ripple into every future controversy. Future corruption cases, future intelligence disputes, future election security fights, future high-profile prosecutions, future congressional investigations. Every one of them becomes harder to resolve because the baseline assumption is already poisoned. And once your baseline is poisoned, even clean evidence struggles to land. That is how institutional paralysis grows. Now let's go one layer deeper and talk about the emotional logic of this story, because politics is not just facts. It is emotion attached to facts. Why are people reacting so intensely? Because Epstein occupies a rare category in the public mind, the scandal that symbolizes hidden power. Most scandals are about a politician, a law, a leak, a bad decision, a conflict of interest. Epstein is different. Epstein triggers a much darker public intuition, that there may be entire networks of elite protection ordinary people are never allowed to fully see. Again, that does not mean every rumor is true. It means the symbol is powerful. And once a symbol like that touches a sitting power structure or a former president, it stops behaving like a normal story. It becomes a psychological event. That is why people do not react to Epstein stories proportionally. They react to what Epstein represents. That is also why government mishandling in this area is so uniquely dangerous. Because even minor procedural failures can get interpreted as confirmation of a much larger hidden order. And once that interpretation takes hold, no institution gets the benefit of the doubt. Now ask yourself this: if the DOJ wanted to maximize public confidence, what would the ideal release have looked like? It would have been clean, complete, clearly explained, consistent in redactions, transparent about what was withheld and why, and accompanied by simple public-facing explanations that ordinary people could actually understand. Instead, what the country got was controversy over what was missing, what was protected, what was restored, and whether politically sensitive material was handled in a way the public can trust. That is a failure even before you argue about motive. And once failure enters the story, politics takes over. Now let's talk directly about what this could mean next for the United States politically. If Bondi's appearance or the DOJ's future responses go badly, this issue could become a durable oversight and campaign narrative. Not because every voter is reading document dumps. They are not. But because They Hid Files is a very simple story, and simple stories travel. That is how politics works. You can spend 90 minutes explaining duplicate coding systems, privilege reviews, and disclosure frameworks. Or your opponent can say, "They said everything was out, it wasn't." Guess which one wins in the public mind? Exactly. That is why process failures are politically lethal. They compress into emotionally legible narratives. And emotionally legible narratives are what move the country. This could also increase pressure for broader archival disclosure, more aggressive congressional review, and more public demands around who else appears in what records and under what circumstances. That creates a second-order danger, because once political actors realize there is energy in release everything, the incentive structure shifts. Some people will genuinely want transparency, others will simply want chaos. And those are not the same thing. This is important. Transparency is not the same as indiscriminate dumping. Accountability is not the same as spectacle, and justice is not the same as viral exposure. A mature democracy has to know the difference. But right now, America is not acting especially mature in this area. It is acting traumatized, suspicious, and digitally inflamed. And institutions are responding in ways that often make that worse. Now let's talk about the global angle briefly because yes, there is one. Foreign governments watch these moments closely. Not because they care about every detail of US scandal culture, but because elite information management is a test of regime confidence. When America looks unable to handle politically dangerous disclosures without spiraling into mutual delegitimization, that weakens the image of US institutional competence abroad. Again, this is not the kind of thing that moves markets overnight by itself, but it contributes to a larger picture, a picture of a superpower whose internal information environment is increasingly unstable. That matters diplomatically. It matters economically, and it matters strategically, because credibility is not only military or financial, it is procedural. Can you run a system people believe? That question sits underneath all of this. And right now, too many Americans would answer, no, that is the real alarm bell. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a place that is uncomfortable but clear. The newly released documents matter, but not in the simplistic way the internet wants. They matter because they contain serious allegations that should not be waved away. They matter because those allegations are not proven and should not be falsely treated as settled fact. They matter because their delayed release raises serious questions about how the DOJ handled politically sensitive material. And they matter because the Bondi subpoena transforms this from a scandal headline into an institutional accountability test. That is the full picture. If you only hold one piece of it, you are being manipulated by your own side or by someone else's. And this is where I want to return to the promise from the beginning. The key insight that explains the bigger picture is this: in modern American politics, the control of narrative timing has become almost as powerful as the underlying evidence itself. That is the heart of this story. Not because evidence does not matter, it does, but because when evidence emerges through a process the public no longer trusts, timing becomes political meaning. And once timing becomes meaning, every delay looks strategic. Every omission looks intentional, every correction looks suspicious, every explanation sounds self-serving. That is exactly what happened here, and that is why this story is so dangerous for the institutions involved. Because even if some of the DOJ's explanations are technically true, the sequence of events has already taught millions of Americans to interpret the release as narrative management. Once that lesson lands, trust does not come back easily. That is the deeper damage, not just to one administration, not just to one politician, not just to one case, to the civic ability of the country to process truth without instantly converting it into tribal warfare. That is what is slipping away, and if you care about this country, that should worry you more than any single headline, because a society can survive scandal, it can survive corruption, it can survive ugly revelations. What it struggles to survive is the permanent belief that nobody will ever tell the whole truth unless they are forced, and maybe not even then. That is where democracies start getting hollow, and that is why this story matters. Not because it gives one clean answer, but because it reveals how broken the answer-making machinery has become. That is the real takeaway, not certainty, not hysteria, not denial, clarity. And the clearest thing we can say right now is this: the allegations in these newly released files are serious. They remain unproven. The DOJ's handling of the release has become its own major political problem. And Pam Bondi's looming appearance before Congress may tell us less about what happened decades ago than about whether the US government can still explain itself honestly in the present. That is where we are. And that is why this story is not over. If you want more independent political analysis without the cable news theater, subscribe now, because stories like this are only going to get more complicated, not less. And I want to hear from you on one specific question. Do you think the bigger issue here is the allegation itself, or the way the DOJ handled the release? Put that in the comments, because honestly, that answer says a lot about where you think America's real crisis is right now. And if you know someone who follows politics but is tired of the noise and wants the facts without the spin, share this with them, because the country does not need more panic. It needs more people who can still think clearly when the headlines get hot.